Quake, Disaster in San Francisco, 1906, Chapter 7, Part 2. Remember, we just left off where they found out that Chicago and Seattle and Salt Lake City had also had great trauma. Page 60, top of the page. Mrs. Alexander shot her daughter-in-law a worried look. Dear God, Mary. It's just what I was worried about. Remember, Mr. Walsh was just telling us that Los Angeles is burning up. He said this dreadful earthquake was only part of a much larger disaster. Pardon me, San said. Did you say Los Angeles was damaged? She nodded. Then all the rest of California is also in trouble? San asked. His voice was laden. Oakland is just across the bay. My father is in Oakland. A single tear rolled down his cheek, leaving a shiny trail across his dusty skin. Mary put her hand on San's shoulder. Now look, we don't know if Oakland is in trouble or not. Let's not get ourselves all upset before we know what really happened. I heard a man saying that the earthquake hit New York City, Jacob added. New York, Chicago, Seattle, and Salt Lake City? Who knows where else? Mrs. Alexander muttered. Didn't I tell you we should be more careful about using up our food, Mary? If this disaster has hit so many cities, there won't be any relief aid coming in. Won't we be in a pretty pickle, with little Willie to look after and no food? Mother, please, Mary sighed. Remember, Frank told you that we've got to keep calm. These are just rumors. There's no way to get news into the city yet. She looked at the boys. How could Chicago get swallowed by a tidal wave? That doesn't make a bit of sense. Chicago's nowhere near the ocean. Until we get some real news, it's foolish to believe everything that people are saying. Jacob picked a blade of grass and twirled it between his fingers. San lowered his eyes as if he'd been scolded. After an awkward pause, Mary asked San how he'd gotten separated from his family. As he told his story, she nodded sympathetically. While they talked, the baby fell asleep on the blanket next to her. Even though daylight was beginning to fade, the temperature in the park was rising. Lavender plumes of smoke billowed up into the blood-red sky, and the sooty air burned Jacob's nose and throat. The fires made a roaring noise that muffled the sounds of the crowd around them. A light dusting of ash had settled on Mary's skirt and the baby's blanket. It reminded Jacob of the flour that used to collect on his mother's hair and dress when she was baking. People continued to straggle in and join the crowd in the square. Jacob thought about getting up and searching faces again, but his legs ached and his full belly made him reluctant to move. If only he could rest a little while longer. He closed his eyes. A boom startled him. What's that? My husband said the army was dynamiting buildings in the surrounding streets, Mary said. They must be getting close. Do you think it's safe to stay here? Jacob asked. I think we're safe enough, Mary said. Frank says the square is a natural fire break. Flames can't jump across such a wide space between buildings. Anyway, I'm sure the soldiers would make us leave if there was any danger. The older Mrs. Alexander kept glancing at the street. What could be keeping Frank? She asked her daughter-in-law. He could have walked from here to the house and back again 10 times over by now. Oh, you know Frank, Mother, Mary said lightly. He's probably sharing stories with some of the soldiers, or he might have offered to help a family carry their trunks and lost track of time. The older woman kneaded her hands together. Familiar tunes began to drift over the park. A few people had banjos, violins, and other musical instruments with them. Others chimed in with the melodies. Mary began to sing the lyrics of one song. Her sweet, reedy voice made Jacob think of his mother, of how she used to sing to him and Sophie at night. Jacob remembered how his father used to tease Mamma about singing off-key. But Jacob didn't care. He'd always loved listening to her voice. Long after he'd grown too old to ask for a lullaby himself, he liked to listen when Mamma tucked Sophie into bed with a song. Another loud boom shook the ground, and conversations all over the square stopped abruptly. Then the piano player banged on his keys as if to echo the dynamite. He struck up a song called There'll Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight. People laughed and clapped. A pair of men stood up and danced an impromptu jig. Here comes Frank, Mary announced. She stood smiling and held out her arms. Frank was a tall, athletic-looking man with a neat mustache. He put his arms around Mary and kissed her on the mouth. Then he leaned over and gave his mother a peck on the cheek. She beamed at him. "Where have you been, son?" she asked. "I was awfully worried about you." "I got conscripted," Frank said. "A policeman ordered me to help clear the street. He must have nabbed a dozen of us. Insisted we clear all the bricks and rubble off one of them side streets so automobiles could get through. Said all the able-bodied men in the city are expected to help." The sound of his father's voice woke the baby. Frank picked up the child and swung him through the air. Willie's squeals made Quake yip like a puppy. Smiling, Frank bounced the baby up and down on his knee, and Mary handed him a sausage on a slice of bread. While her husband ate, Mary introduced him to the boys and told him about the rumors circulating around the park. "A tidal wave washed away Chicago, eh?" Frank grinned. "Now that's a good one." He looked at the boys. "Misery loves company, doesn't it? Here we are, wondering if anything's going to be left of our city after this fire has burned itself out. And people are busy inventing stories about other cities in worse shape than us." "How does it look downtown, Frank?" his mother asked. "Truthfully, it's pretty bad, Ma. Doesn't seem like the army can get ahead of the flames," Frank said. "No sooner do the soldiers blow up on one building than the wind carries a spark across the rubble and sets the rest of the block on fire. The Grand Opera House has burned up, you know. Even the Palace Hotel is on fire." The old woman's forehead creased. She put her hand against her cheek and shook her head. "What about our house?" Mary asked. "Sorry, honey. I never could get through. The policemen have our street blocked off. Wouldn't have done a bit of good if I did get into the place, though. They've given the orders to shoot looters, and the soldiers aren't taking the time to ask questions. It's dangerous to be seen carrying anything out of a building, even if it really belongs to you." They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Mrs. Alexander said she was tired. "I guess we might as well stretch out here and get a little sleep," she said. "It's as good a place as any." Son looked at Jacob. "I see that people are still coming into the square." Jacob sighed and stood up. "You're right. We should have another look through the crowd." He smiled at Mary. "Thanks again for dinner." "If you don't find your family here, what will you do?" Mary asked. Jacob shrugged. "I don't know." "Why don't you find yourselves a spot to stretch out until morning, said Frank. "It's much too crowded over here," Mrs. Alexander said, gesturing to the area around the statue, "but I'm sure you can find yourselves a little room to sleep." Looking at Son, she added, "Maybe over there where you saw those Chinamen." "Union Square's a safe place to stay tonight, boys," Frank said. "If you don't find your families here, then I'd head for Golden Gate Park tomorrow. I hear lots of folks have gone out there to take shelter." Before they left, Son bowed his head and shoulders. "I will remember your kindness always." Mary and Frank smiled at the boys and wished them good luck. Mrs. Alexander pursed her lips and said, "I hope you find your people. Both of you." The boys and Quake began to wander through the square again. They wove in and out of groups of people, stopping to decide their families, and to anyone who would listen. Several other people were doing the same thing. One woman stopped the boys and asked whether they had seen her child, a red-haired boy that she said was a little shorter than Jacob. The woman's voice kept breaking as she spoke. In the glow from the fire, Jacob could see tears shining on the rims of her eyes. Exhausted, Jacob and Son sat down near a clump of bushes. Against the black sky, the flames formed a flickering wall of colors, orange and red darting in and out of the grayish plumes of smoke. It was so bright that Jacob could see Son's features almost as clearly as in the daylight. "You said your mother can't walk very far?" he asked Son. "Her feet are bound." "Bound?" Jacob asked. "So they will remain small. It's an old Chinese custom, the mark of an upper-class woman." Son was quiet for a minute. Then he turned to Jacob. "And your mother? You have not mentioned her, only your father and your sister Sophie." "My mother died," Jacob said. "Last December. She was having a baby." "And the baby?" Jacob shook his head. "Dead, too. It was a boy. It would have been my little brother." "I am deeply sorry," Son said. After that, the boys stopped talking. They lay down on their backs beside each other, and Quake crawled in between them. As the two boys stroked the dog's fur, Quake stretched out his front paws, resting his head on Jacob's chest, and shut his eyes. Jacob watched the flames for what seemed like hours. In his thoughts he retraced his day, from before dawn, when he first left home, until afternoon, when he arrived in Union Square. He kept telling himself that Papa and Sophie were all right, but questions kept flashing into his mind. Why didn't I find them in the produce district? Where are they? Where should I go looking for them tomorrow? A fine dusting of ash sifted onto Jacob's clothes, his hair, and everything he touched. The smoke and ash were stinging his eyes, and he squeezed his eyelids shut. But he knew it wasn't just smoke that caused a drop of water to roll down his cheek and pool in his ear. He was scared as he'd ever been. Although Union Square was jammed with refugees, Jacob felt alone and stranded, like the only survivor of a shipwreck. When he finally began to doze, he dreamed he was a little boy, and it was sweltering summer night in their boarding house. Mamma sat in a kitchen chair by the open window. He padded out of bed and pushed another chair close to hers. Then he curled himself onto his chair and laid his head on Mamma's lap. Her bony knees made a hard pillow, but he refused to crawl back into his own bed. Mamma began to sing, her voice sweet and reedy, her soft hand resting on his chest. Smiling proudly, Papa watched over them.